Tonight's session is called Revolution from Below, and it's a talk and a discussion led by Daniel Lazare on the American revolutionary tradition. And this is part of a series of talks and discussions on the theme of revolution, and it's covered a number of revolutionary movements. Last week we looked at the levelers and the diggers in the English Revolution. And tonight's discussion, I think, is going to be one of the important ones, particularly for people in Britain, because I think even those of us on the left who are aware that there's a very strong revolutionary tradition in the United States are not always aware of the details and indeed the significance of that tradition. And given recent political events in the United States and above all the continuing presidential campaign, and many of the debates about the importance of the sort of American revolutionary tradition, the Constitution, and indeed the relationship of the United States to its history and its founding moment, I think this discussion this evening is very apposite. Just a couple of reminders. Dan has very kindly provided a reading list, and there are also some other reading lists for the previous sessions, which have now gone up onto our education page. So if you want to follow up from this evening, there are plenty of books there to look at. And indeed, if you want to add some suggestions of your own, that's also quite possible. The format of this evening will be, Dan will begin and give an introductory talk, and then we'll move to questions and discussion. The format of the question and discussion period will be that Dan will respond to a point or respond to a question and then move on to the next person. So it'll be very much a one-to-one pattern. So it means, I think, trying to get in as early as you can at a premium will be quite important here. The way to indicate if you want to take part in the questions is to use the participants button. And if you press participants, it should show a list of everybody who's in the meeting. And you then click the section raise hand, and then that's a way for me to call you in. Another way, if you're not really very clear on doing that, is to just type in the chat section and ask to come into the discussion. I'll be chairing the first part up until about 6:45, and then Ben Davey will take over. So there are two of us working the system, so it should work. Anyway, fingers crossed. And okay, well, you've had enough from me, so I'll just introduce Dan, and he's now going to speak on Revolution from Below, the American revolutionary tradition, 1760 to 1815. So away you go, Dan. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, thank you very much, Kevin. So the period in question covers, I guess it's roughly 1760 or 1763, which is the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. And continues up until roughly 1815, which is when the, well, what in America is called the War of 1812 ended, a war with Great Britain. And I'd like to begin with a quote from Lenin, which in his letter to American workers in August 19 described the American War of Independence as, quote, one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars. This is probably my least favorite quote by Lenin, because I think it's a great simplification, and because I think the American revolutionary tradition is a deeply ambiguous one. So the overall tenor of my talk will be actually very negative, in contrast to most US leftists who are trying to be upbeat and accentuate all the positive aspects in the US tradition. I'm going to actually emphasize the negative aspects. And the reason I'm doing so is that the problem we face now is that how did this country, which according to Lenin was born in one of those really great revolutionary liberating wars, how did this country wind up to be such a bloated, grotesque, corrupt mess? Is it something that happened? In other words, America's origins were how corrupted later, or can we trace these tendencies back to America's foundings? And I actually believe it's the latter case, and I believe any kind of concept of America of the American project as a whole must take into account the ambivalent or ambiguous nature of the American Revolution. So in American historiography, traditionally, there's been a great debate between liberals and conservatives. Liberals who stress the progressive, democratic, revolutionary aspect of the War of Independence, and conservatives who portray the War of Independence really as a restoration, an attempt to undo the damage that was caused by the British from 1763 on, and return to the halcyon days before British imperialism really began interfering in American affairs in a serious way. And I actually tend toward more the conservative point of view, of course, refracted through a Marxist lens, ironically. But I think it's very important to stress a number of things about America. One is that America was wealthier by the 1770s than Europe was. Individual Americans had much better standard of living, much better food. They were in general better educated, and in fact, in New England, which I know it's a British audience, that's the 6 northeastern states: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. In New England, with its Puritan heritage, literacy approached 100%. And actually, New England was the poorest part of America at the time, but the best educated, and in most respects, the best organized. Americans also had the highest rate of democracy in the world. The voting eligibility by the 18th century for white adult males ranged from 50% to upwards of 80% or higher in New England. This is far, far, far in excess of anything that existed in the old world, with the possible exception of some certain cantons in Switzerland. And also America, especially New England, which was founded in 1620 to 1630, had a very conservative / democratic tradition. That is, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were those who fled England in response to the Stuart dynasty, and the Stuart dynasty's attempt to sort of modernize or Frenchify or continentalize the British system, and efforts that were fiercely opposed, of course, by the Puritans and the English Puritans and the American Puritans, those Puritans who fled to Massachusetts in 1629, were fleeing what they saw as Stuart centralization, what we might now actually call Stuart modernization, ironically. And they came here prior to the Civil War. The Civil War almost shut down emigration entirely. So the generation that arrived in the 1630s in New England would be the last generation that would arrive for decades after. And therefore, they were not witness to the Cromwellian Revolution. And Cromwell, as we know, started out trying to defend the old ways against Stuart encroachment, but wound up, of course, mounting a very powerful revolution of his own, in which he introduced completely new governing techniques. He chopped off the head of the king, did away with the monarchy, did away with the House of Lords, and established a dictatorship by the House of Commons, all completely novel, completely unprecedented, completely unconstitutional. But those were all developments that the American Puritans missed out on. So consequently, the American Puritans were sort of left in a kind of a post-Tudor, pre-Stuart nirvana, in which they firmly believed that the ancient ways were the best. The ancient ways were the most democratic, the most virtuous, the most rigorously Protestant, the most patriotic. And this mindset carried on through for a full century and a half, especially in New England, to the period of the 1760s and 70s. It was very much full blown, which is why the New Englanders responded so forcefully to British attempts to change the constitutional relationship between the colonies and the mother country. So this happened in the wake of the 7 Years' War, as I said. And the 7 Years' War greatly expanded the British Empire, especially in North America, and eliminated the French presence in North America. So the British faced a problem. They had a new, greatly enlarged territory they had to administer, and therefore they had to get the whole thing in hand. So they had to create a new government for Quebec. They had to take charge of the interior region that was east of the Mississippi to the Appalachian Mountains. Virtually all American settlements at the time were to the east of the Appalachians. Very few settlers had penetrated to the west of the Appalachians. And they had to create new revenue sources because the kingdom was very heavily in debt due to the 7 Years' War. So they introduced a series of internal revenue raising measures in America, which led to profound constitutional crises. Because America had always been used to self-government. It had its colonial legislatures had functioned for more than a century at that point. They perceived a division of responsibility in which they were in charge of all internal affairs, and the British imperial authorities were allowed to deal with customs and trade, but nothing else. So when Britain attempted to rearrange constitutional priorities in order to put the empire on a more modern footing, the colonies rose up in an uproar. And there were boycotts, protests of a quite serious nature. And eventually the British retreated and abolished the Stamp Act, the most notorious of the Townshend Acts. The Stamp Acts, by the way, were a royal stamp you had to purchase for most legal documents and even newspapers. So the British retreated, but they did keep in place, as a point of honor, a internal tax on tea, among other things. And this led to renewed protests in America, and renewed protests because Americans saw this as the opening wedge of a wholesale reconstitutionalization of the colonies, in which the colonies would be deprived of their rights of self-government. And their internal affairs would come under the direct control of Westminster. So this led to a deepening furor. In 1775, in 1774 actually, the British, in response to the famous Boston Tea Party, the British closed Boston Harbor in order to punish the rebels until they made restitution for the tea that had been thrown overboard. And fighting broke out in April 1775 at the Battle of Concord and Lexington. And then in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the colonists essentially imposed great damage on the British forces, and the British were forced actually to withdraw from Boston, and they would never come back to Boston. And I just must point out, in this this kind of Cromwellian fever that spread through New England. Thousands of volunteers rushed to the battle in Boston from all over New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, et cetera, et cetera. And they mounted an extremely militant offensive, which, as I say, drove the king's forces out of Boston. So in a certain sense, it was like, it was kind of 1649 all over again. They didn't chop off the head of the king, but they drove the king out, which kind of reinforces its Cromwellian character. In 1776, however, the British reinvaded, launched a major investigation of New York City, where I am located now, established a base there and used it to ravage the Middle Atlantic colonies, that being New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, etc. And Washington won a few key victories here and there, but was mostly on the run. Was not faring very well at all. And Americans suffered from grave difficulties, mostly due to their own internal disorganization and their perfect allergy to centralized government control. But in 1788, an alliance was formed with France, and in 1781, Franco-American forces succeeded in defeating a British army in Yorktown, in Virginia, marking the end of the war. So American independence was achieved, and that independence was codified with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So why am I so ambivalent? I mean, here's a colony which rose in revolt, and one cast off imperial control. That seems to be one of the first great wars of national liberation. But wars of national liberation are almost always ambiguous. There's one famous anecdote, which I think is very important, which sums up the tenor of the American War of Independence. In 1842, a journalist caught up with the last surviving veteran of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which had occurred in 1775. That would be nearly 60 years earlier. And the veteran, whose name was Captain Prescott, who was by now 91 years old, in an interview confessed that he had never paid the stamp tax, had never drunk tea, never read John Locke, much less Rousseau. And so the interviewer was quite perplexed and asked them, well, if you didn't do any of these things, why did you fight at Lexington and Concord? And Captain Prescott answered, young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we had always governed ourselves and we always meant to. They didn't mean us to. So this sums up the restorationist quality of the American Revolution. The fact that it was simultaneously democratic and conservative, in that it wanted to turn the clock not forward, but backward to the period before heavy-handed British interference. Now, one of the books on the reading list is a book that I'm not sure if British audiences are really familiar with. It was written by an American named Robert R. Palmer from 1959 to 64. It's a 2-volume work. It's called The Age of the Democratic Revolution. And to my mind, it's one of the really great historical texts. It in some ways anticipates Hobsbawm's Age of the Revolution, Age of Revolution. It's not as good in some respects, of course, but it's actually better in other respects, in that Hobsbawm barely mentions America. But Palmer focuses very heavily on the American Revolution. And the reason he does so is that the period he examines is 1760 to 1800. And in the early decades of that period, the first decades of that period, saw revolutionary disturbances across the Western world. England, with the John Wilkes affair, for example, Ireland, Belgium and Holland, and Poland. These were all democratic revolutions. And they were all a response, not only to the economic problems of the day, the world had entered into a very serious recession in the 1760s, but also to a phenomenon that actually Hobsbawm examines, which is known as the aristocratic restoration. And from the mid-18th century on, the aristocratic forces throughout Western Europe were intent on regaining their old privileges against a rising bourgeois nouveau riche element. This phenomenon was true, especially in France, where Hobsbawm talks about the return of this very famous example is the return of the four quarters. In the French military, if you wanted to become an officer, you had to prove that you had noble origins going back at least 4 generations. And that meant assembling and presenting to the appropriate authority a huge number of documents dealing with your grandparents, marital records, family, property ownership, genealogical records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to qualify for an officership, you had to show that your 4 grandparents were all of noble origin, and that was new. That had not happened before. But the aristocracy was mounting an offensive and was attempting to beat back the nouveau riche bourgeois elements. And in France, in fact, the huge battles were fought over the Parlement. These were regional courts in Paris and in the provinces, which were run by the nobility, whose job was to certify the constitutionality of all laws made by the king. And the king, actually Louis XV, had tried to dissolve the parliaments. He had briefly dissolved the parliaments, but Louis XVI, when he took over in, I believe, 1760, had no choice but to bring the parliaments back. And the parliaments were extremely aggressive in battling what they saw as royal despotism. So throughout Europe, Democrats responded to this aristocratic restoration with a democratic restoration of their own. In other words, an attempt to recapture their old rights that were under assault from the nobility. And this gave a conservative character to all the democratic revolts from 1760 to 1789, because they were all intent in one way or another of turning back the clock to a halcyon period before the empire or before the aristocracy had taken the offensive. Now, I am simplifying greatly, but that is the essence of the phenomenon that we saw. And in America too, was as well. I mean, not only were the British trying to tighten up control, but they were also trying to take control of the colonial governorships and to take control of colonial assemblies, deprive them of their powers, strip them of their responsibilities, et cetera, in order to impose a heightened degree of imperial control. we even saw this in Switzerland, for example, where the primitive, backward, quote, democratic, unquote, Alpine cantons of the South, the original members of the Swiss Confederation of 1291, were very intent on protecting their ancient liberties, their town meetings, their folk gatherings, etc., against any kind of foreign encroachment. This became especially important in the 1790s when Napoleon formed the Helvetic Republic, but still the tendency was there. Liberty was to be found in ancient forms of representation, which the nobility and the crown, sometimes together, sometimes separately, were moving to constrain. So, for example, in America, the Declaration of Independence declares, one of the reasons it assails George III, it accuses him of taking away our charters, abolishing our most laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. So the British were accused, the British sin was to change things, and Americans didn't want change. So I've gone through the war, and I just want to talk about briefly. So the war ended in 1783 or 1781 to 83. The US Constitution was created in 1787. It was ratified by the great majority of states in 1788, and George Washington took office in 1789, which marks the start of the first US government. Washington takes office in March 1789, and in May 1789, just 2 months later, of course, as we know, what happens is the meeting of the États Généraux in Versailles and the start of the French Revolution. But I just want to stress, and I'm sure this is a familiar idea to everybody who's listening in, that the French Revolution was the first modern revolution because it broke with the conservative revolutions of 1760 to 89, in that it quickly demanded a new wholesale revision of French society and government. So I just want to emphasize the newness, and the newness happened immediately when the Third Estate demanded that the other two estates cease their separate meetings and join the Third Estate in what was labeled a National Assembly. And that was something completely new, completely unconstitutional, according to the old way of doing things, completely unjustified in terms of, unsupported in terms of precedent, completely novel. And this novelty, which the world had never seen before, was what marked the start of the French Revolution and the distinctiveness of the French Revolution. I must point out that Jefferson was in Paris in 1788, just as the aristocracy, the aristocratic restoration was reaching its crescendo, and Louis XVI was preparing to endorse, to approve a meeting of the États Généraux, actually, which had never met before and had never met since 1614, but now they would meet again after a period of 160, 170 years. And Jefferson's friends were Lafayette and Condorcet. Lafayette, of course, would desert the revolution in 1791 after a futile attempt to rescue Marie Antoinette from the clutches of the radicals. And Condorcet would wind up, who's a Girondin, would wind up perishing during the Terror. But Jefferson, in his meetings with these other two men, was the most conservative. Jefferson hoped that the États Généraux would proceed slowly and cautiously, and be very modest in their demands. And that was, of course, completely impossible. So my point merely is that Jefferson, who's often seen as the most radical of Americans, found himself outpaced from the very start, from before the revolution, by two Frenchmen who actually were not even very revolutionary, but would come to be French standards. So that just illustrates the conservatism of the American Revolution and correspondingly the radicalism of the French Revolution. I'm skipping around because there's a great deal to cover. I've written a book about the US Constitution, which also takes a very skeptical look at the US Constitution. The US Constitution, which was created in 1787, as I said, and ratified in 1788, was an attempt, I would describe it as a kind of a sideways advance into the future. I mean, it was an attempt to modernize pre-existing constitutional relations in America by guaranteeing a high degree of states' rights and state autonomy, while creating a powerful new government, but committing that government to the protection of those states' rights. So the Constitution created a new politics, which was very exciting, very important, and very a small d. But it's still, its attitude towards modernity, towards modernization was again highly ambivalent. It wanted to move forward by somehow recapturing and strengthening the past. Which then brings us to the question of slavery. Now, Palmer, whose work I like so much, nonetheless makes a very serious mistake. As an American writing in the late 50s and early 60s, he says that the American Revolution was the only truly successful democratic revolution until the French Revolution. And he argues that the aristocratic restoration was beaten back in America and never again reared its head. But he's wrong, because America he was personally a very liberal person who was progressive on racial matters, but America still was deep in the throes of racial segregation at that point. And even the most liberal American historians didn't quite appreciate or understand the historical importance of slavery. So while it's true that the American Revolution did beat back the aristocratic restoration, it set about creating a new aristocratic recrudescence, I guess you call it, through slavery. Slavery had actually suffered grave damage during the Revolution. Not only had 4 or 5 northern states either abolished slavery or anti-slavery laws that put themselves on the path to abolition, but thousands of slaves had run away to join British forces, who offered them freedom if they enlisted in the Royalist army. So American slaves were royalist and anti-republican, ironically. So thousands had fled. So the institution of slavery was actually on the defensive in 1787, when the founders met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. It was weak, it was isolated, it was on the defensive. So what the founders did, because the slave states had made it very clear they would not join the Union unless their demands were satisfied, the founders made concession after concession to the slave owners, not only to protect slavery in the slave states, but to give slave owners a stranglehold over national politics via the famous 3/5 clause, which allowed each slave to be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional apportionment, which by 1860 would give South 25 extra seats in the House of Representatives. The question of equal state representation in the Senate, which gave the South parity in the Senate, and also an amending clause, which essentially gave the South veto power over any constitutional changes, and finally a electoral college, which would choose the president, which also gave the Southern slave states extra clout. As a result, Washington became president from 1788 or 89 actually, until 1796, and John Adams of Massachusetts became president from 1797 to 1801. And thereafter, with one exception, that being John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, every president would be a slave owner and would be obeisant to the South. So consequently, the result of the Constitution and the result of the America's defeat of the aristocratic, restoration of the 1760s and 70s was to reestablish a strange bastard aristocracy composed of Southern slave owners who would dominate the new republic and would grow ever more powerful over the ensuing 70-odd years. So America therefore became a kind of a neo-aristocratic republic by virtue of Lenin's really liberating, really revolutionary war. So this is the height of irony, to say the least. I'm going to be giving a talk in a few weeks about the U.S. Civil War. But let me just very briefly say that I regard the U.S. Civil War as essentially the second stage of the American Revolution. It was America's Jacobin Revolution, as opposed to the Girondin-dominated first stage. Of course, inaugurated the Terror. The Terror was a terrible event. And the estimates are that 300,000 people may have perished in both via the guillotine and also in the suppression of the Vendée uprising and other such events. That's 300,000 people out of a population of about 25 million people, or roughly 1 person in 83, according to my. But when the second stage of the US Revolution happened, i.e. the Civil War, the Jacobin stage, the Civil War would wind up costing 750,000 lives out of a population of about 31 million. That is 1 per 41. So the Jacobin Revolution in the United States would wind up being, proportional to population, better than twice as bloody as the Jacobin Revolution was in France in 1789 to 94. So essentially America paid a huge price by postponing the second act by 70 some years. Anyway, that concludes my talk. So if anyone has any questions or any comments, I'd love to hear them. And Kevin, you'll be in charge from this point on. Is that correct?
Dan, no, I'll be finishing off in a few moments, and
Okay.
Dan will be taking over.
Okay.
I've got 2 hands up there. The first one is Steve O'Neill. So Steve, if you'd like to come in, and then the second one will be Anthony Brain. Okay, Steve, if you'd like to come in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Daniel. That's a fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you're familiar with the Somerset case, whereby an American slave owner brought his slave to England, and the slave said, well, I'm in England. It's a non-slaveholding entity, so therefore I declare my freedom. It went to court, and the court found in favor of this black slave named Somerset. And I understand this rattled a lot of cages in the U.S., or what was then the colonies. So do you think this had a lot of influence in perpetrating the American Revolution among the slave owners, such as Jefferson and Washington? And,
yeah, that's a very big issue these days. And the question is that, so this is the Somerset decision, I think in 1770, correct? Which essentially abolished slavery in England itself. And I think, by the way, the slave owner was not an American, he was a Caribbean planter who brought his slave to England and was forced to set him free. So the question is whether this excited fear among American slave owners, and whether they were therefore anxious to free themselves from England because they saw England as an abolitionist force that was threatening their own slaveholding practices. Historically, the answer seems to be, there's a good deal of debate, but historically the answer seems to be no. British slavery continued in the Caribbean undisturbed until the 1830s, obviously. There's no evidence of any kind of disturbances in America itself that were triggered by that decision. What happened in 1775, I think it was Lord Dunmore, a commander of British forces, offered freedom to any American slave who ran away and joined British forces, and thousands did. And this this did cause panic among American planters. But by that point, the revolution was already well underway. So it certainly did kind of stiffen the resolve of the Virginia Patriots, we want to call them that. But it did not really precipitate the rebellion. The rebellion really began in New England among the Puritan neo-Cromwellians, as I would call them. I would just, by the way, I'd point out that Virginia, in I think 1777 or 1778, offered all new recruits, anyone who would join the Revolutionary Army, 40 acres of land and a slave. So I mean, that certainly affects that certainly tells you something about the character, the very ambiguous character of the American Revolution, because at the same time, anti-slavery sentiment was growing in the North as a result of the revolution. So the revolution was already embarking on heading down two separate paths. And so when the founders finally met in 1787, 10 years later, their task was to somehow hold these two very different parts of the country together, and to prevent the South from splitting off and going its own way. So that's it.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. I'm going to go to Steve now. Steve, can you unmute? You're unmuted.
Sorry, yeah, I'm unmuted. Sorry, is somebody expecting me to? Okay, I'll make a comment, but was somebody expecting me to make a comment? I wasn't particularly thinking I was going to. I haven't put my hand up, but anyway. I wanted to ask a question, really. I suppose it fits with this. Sorry? Hello? Yeah. Going to the concept of, can make sense to me, what you call it, the aristocratic republic, or the new aristocratic republic. I should say thank you, Daniel, by the way, for your talk. It was very interesting. The aristocratic republic, I always thought that possibly America might be thought of as being a sort of, although taking the form of a republic, was really a kind of elected monarchy. In other words, what you do in America is you elect your king, But then you have a constitution that means that the king doesn't have too much power, and he can only stay in office for a couple of goes at it, and then we have to have another king, etc. And George Washington, a bit like Cromwell, I think, was offered the king, if I'm right, and offered the kingship, but turned it down, and as Cromwell did. And so that fits with your description of it being as an aristocratic republic. So it takes all the form and the ideas of republicanism, but it actually gives so much executive power to the center and then takes it away through states' rights and in the way that you said. And in a way, did the Civil War, as the Jacobin part of the revolution, did it really solve the slave problem? Did it solve the built-in nature of racism? And I think obviously the answer to that is no, but does that mean that America needs a Republican revolution? It hasn't got the form of republicanism which would be really democratic, but it's been left with this weird thing from 1789 or whenever it was. So that's my kind of question.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. So America has this conservative democratic heritage, and the country is built, it's constructed in a way which is intensely conservative. And commentators have noticed this, Tocqueville on. In fact, Tocqueville was fascinated by America because France's journey to democracy had been so bloody, whereas America's in some ways was very natural. Like kind of America kind of sort of fell into it without having a revolution of a French-style revolution. But the result is that we are left with what is really only a quasi-democracy. We have a monarchical president. We have a weak Congress. We have states' rights, which are appalling, and we have individual rights and civil rights, which are only incompletely realized, and we have a legacy of racism, which is as strong as ever. By certain measures, it's getting stronger in structural terms. So yes, I mean, it's a half-formed, it's a Quasimodo, a half-formed, quasi-democratic structure that is desperately in need of a wholesale democratic makeover, which of course can only happen through revolutionary socialist means.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to bring in Anthony now.
I haven't used this computer before. Can you hear me?
We can.
I think the great contribution Marx and Engels made to history is the royal class struggle. Now, when capitalism had to rise against feudalism in England, France, Holland, War of Independence against the Spanish 80-year war, and then the first American Revolution, they had to mobilize over class to get the feudal aristocracy overthrown. They couldn't do it on their own. And if you didn't have a program for them, they couldn't be used. And that was Trotsky's whole analysis of the ordinary middle class. And Jacobinism was that program, that period of capitalist, what became that period of capitalist development. Obviously, the American War of Independence was a political revolution. It's one capitalist system within the framework of capitalism, but it had social consequences in terms of how the wealth was redistributed against the British aristocracy and the British capitalists. And that was Trotsky's formula, how the Soviet Union degenerated. A political revolution, get rid of the bureaucracy, redistribute the resource, but keep the planned economy. So some of those formulas are interesting with the American War of Independence. But the reason the slave owners, I was saying in my comments, went along with the liberal capitalists was to get more share of the world market. They had to fight the British anyway. But I'm doing a course that doing these online courses now, and in America, one of the courses are actually saying, because of the 7-year war, there was a fiscal crisis, and they wanted to tax all the American capitalists, and that led to the War of Independence ultimately. This is what led to the rebellion. And so they gave it a liberal ideology to mobilize the masses. Once they consolidated power of the capitalists, then they made deals with the slave owners to suppress the masses. But as what George Novak, the American Trotskyist historian, either one side or the other had to win. slavery and the capitalist system couldn't work together all forever. One society has to win over another society. So the second civil war was a social revolution, but to replace slave labor with wage capitalist labor. I want to make one more point. And Trotskyi's big contribution was the law of uneven and combined development, negative features, positive features, bit of both, a combination of combinations. I mean, this is relevant today because there could be a civil war now. I mean, capitalism's been a reactionary system since 1914. What Jim Cannon argued was the revolutionary tradition of the first American rebel, founder of American Trotskyism. So there was the revolutionary tradition of the anti-British capitalism and then the Civil War. That's part of the mass conscience. The Trotskyists and the Marxists have to hegemonize the masses so they can overthrow capitalism. But liberal capitalists may be devious. To get rid of Trump, there might be a civil war where they rebuild this tradition. But it's what Trotsky said in the Spanish Civil War. You don't support the capitalists politically, but there's a civil war between the liberals and the right-wing to the fascists. You have to have military alliance for favor of working class leadership. I'll finish 30 seconds more. The difference between Spain was, Trotsky said the main popular front capitalists were supporting Franco because of the upheaval of the Civil War and the working class resistance. They had to adapt and be liberal. There may not have been Trumps in their way. But Trump may not be in the same interest as Franco was to the main ruling class because of different interests, and thinking he might cause a big upheaval that hegemonizes the masses, and they have to hegemonize the masses. But they might take him on more seriously than Franco. It's a different period and a different world situation. But this is some of the facts we have to consider. We've got to try and hegemonize the masses. Anything's popular in America. The Soviet Union broke up, American capitalism was the next society to blow up.
Thank you. Thanks, Anthony.
Just a quick response. I mean, I agree. The Trotsky's theory of combined and uneven development is very important. But of course, Marx and Engels talked endlessly about the ironies of historical development, and that's the essence of the dialectical method. And America abounds in ironies. And we have the restorationist democracy of the Revolutionary War. We have the quasi-Jacobin Civil War, which destroyed the Southern planters, but ushered in a corporate dictatorship, which would be the most advanced in the world. I mean, American capitalism after the Civil War embarked on its triumphant, road to victory, and which would essentially lead it by 1940 to what Trotsky called the explosion of American imperialism. And I agree that America is facing some kind of emergency now. It looks almost certain that the coming election, which is less than 4 weeks away, will result in some kind of civil disturbances, some kind of civil breakdown. We can't be sure. And I fully agree that the working class should not ally itself with either of the two bourgeois parties. It should maintain absolute independence, defend democracy, but defend democracy on its own terms, not those of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Daniel. Next question from George. George, can you unmute yourself, please?
I can't hear now.
We can't hear you, George. We're getting some technical difficulties. George, if you pop your question in the chat, I'm more than happy to pass it on. Yeah, would that work? Cool. Okay. While you're doing that, Daniel, I've got a question for you. You described the United States as a bloated, grotesque, corrupt mess, and I may quote you in future. It's such a recent construction, emerging so rapidly in terms of histories. As I understand it, the ruling class emerges largely built on ideas taken from our kind of middle-class Whig ideas and cultures and the free press, liberty, constitution. My question is, were there any points where we missed opportunities? Could the American Revolution have ever avoided this conservatism?
Well, not really, because it's a product of historical circumstances. In a certain sense, the American Revolution was too early. If it had come along 20 years later, it would have been very different. But that's what history does. That history sets things up like that. And so therefore, America did draw very heavily from, as you point out, what's known as these old Whig ideas, based on separation of powers, limited government, weak government, decentralized authority, etc. This is holy writ in American political culture. But these are things that the French Revolution completely overturned. In America, royal despotism led to a balanced constitution, and to my mind, 2 centuries of growing stagnation. In France, royal despotism led to a brief period of constitutional balance, then followed by democratic despotism under the Jacobins. So it was one form of despotism that led to another, and I'm actually a big fan of democratic despotism. But America has never achieved this. It kind of approached it during the Civil War, but things rapidly regressed after, and in fact, America fell under a corporate despotism, which has continued really unbroken ever since. And now that the American capitalism is decaying and it's turned into a grotesque caricature of itself, American society is in extreme crisis as well. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to go to Chris. Chris, can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you.
Excellent,
Chris.
excellent. American Constitution. Many years ago, I read quite a bit around Tom Paine from Thetford in Norfolk. And I remember reading, he was in France at the time of the Revolution, jailed, and he travelled back and forward on a boat to America at the time of the Constitution, Age of Reason. In your opinion, did he have any major influence constitution-wise? Because at that revolutionary period, one would think that in some ways it would have had some effect. But I'm interested in your views of Tom Paine.
Well, I mean, Paine is a very important character. My impression is he did not have much of an impact. His influence was really felt most strongly during the Revolution itself, and Common Sense was the famous pamphlet he wrote, which I think was published in 1775. It had an electrifying impact on the colonies and in mobilizing the support for the Revolutionary War. But my sense is that his influence rapidly faded in the 1780s. And in fact, when he returned to America in the late 1790s, he was actually somewhat of an unpopular figure. Because America actually was in turmoil over in response to the French Revolution, deeply divided, and Paine somehow managed to make enemies in both camps. The ideology that he represented had a certain impact for a certain time, but it was overall somewhat limited.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Daniel. We're going to go to Steve and then Anne.
Yeah, here we go. It follows on from something I was saying before. So, if you look on the French left, they're used to having many republics. I think they've had 5 so far. They've come and gone and come back again. And on the French left, they put forward the slogan of a sixth republic. Like they want to get rid of the present one and have a much more democratic version. Now, America's only had one republic as far as I can see, because I don't know if the Civil War created another one, but that's just a question. But is it time for America to have a second republic? We've already had one republic, it didn't last very long, and we could probably do with a second one ourselves. So perhaps we could have multiple republics until eventually we win and the working class comes to power. So Marx said something, final part of this, Marx said something and Engels said something about federalism. He said that federalism was a step forward in America, but it soon become a barrier to democratic change, because federalism would allow more backward parts of the country to have more weight in the constitution than those areas where the working class was concentrated. So it would give a bias in the constitution. And so part of the second American Republic would be to do something about federalism. So that's my question. Is federalism to be done away with in the second American Republic?
I earnestly hope so. I think the only way to understand what's happening in America today is this 233-year-old 18th century system is in its death throes. I mean, America is the most conservative, most hidebound polity on the face of the earth. It is as conservative as Tsarist Russia was, or Imperial China. Constitutional change is completely, not even understood. And this conservatism has only deepened over the years, and you have the quality of politics has plummeted, government has ceased to work, corruption has reached massive limits. We have a character like Trump, and we have a fact that the coming elections may very well end in some kind of major disorders, and that perhaps we'll see the imposition of an authoritarian regime. We don't know, it's impossible to speculate, but that certainly is a possibility. So I think this 233-year-old constitutional regime is finally crumbling. And when it does crumble, I mean, they can prop it up through authoritarian measures, and the Constitution will turn into its opposite, will become a framework for an outright authoritarian regime. But when that does happen, when it finally breaks, America will enter into a real revolutionary moment. I mean, this is what happened in France in 1789. The old constitutional system, they did have a constitutional system. The old constitutional system simply fell apart in May 1789, and a huge vacuum of power vacuum opened up. And the revolution was all about how to fill that power vacuum, and with what? To create a new form of government in the wake of the total collapse of the old form of government. And I think that America is heading for some kind of rendezvous with destiny along those lines.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to go to Anne next.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to put my video on because I'm in bed with a virus, not the virus, just a cold virus, I hope. Anyway, so Daniel, it was really interesting for me, and I am going to get your book. But what it reminds me of is the Irish Constitution in a certain sense, in that the Irish Constitution was, I believe, heavily influenced by the American Constitution. And it's extremely, we have an enormous, nothing to the same extent as in the United States, but we have an enormous amount of litigation and court action and use of judicial review and all of these type of to bring about change. That's how it's all meant to happen, is through these forms. Anyway, the second point I wanted to make was about, you know, the fact that you said that, you know, it was backward looking as well as being, it was contradictory. It was looking backwards and looking forwards in a sense. And like, again, I mean, I just wondered about that. As you said, it was in a sense predetermined by its own historical context, and therefore that perhaps the looking backwards is a form of utopianism which was inescapable in that period. You know, when Engels talks about like true socialism and various forms of utopian socialism that existed even in the, well, what will we say, you know, 17, 18, early 1800s. You know, you think about the fact that the kind of ideologies of revolutions at an earlier stage were perhaps, I'm not saying predetermined, but almost inescapably necessary for them to look to the past, because they didn't have the material conditions to really go forward in a modernist sense. Anyway, I don't know if that's clear. And then it made me think about James Connolly and his ideas. And, you know, often James Connolly is looked on as, you know, the great Irish revolutionary. And, you know, he's lauded and you know, it was really actually very hard to criticize him. But when I looked for an article I did on him, at his writings, it was enormously conservative in many respects, like looking to the past, to the kind of old clan system, to kind of traditional forms, you know, perhaps like in a different sense to, you know, what was happening in America at that time, in a different context, in a different historical context, but nevertheless looking backwards rather than to the future. And then just finally, in relation to your point, which you have often made about, you know, the United States is just careering towards some sort of major kind of, you know, collapse, or, you know, I just want to ask you like about the question of kind of transcending this rather than seeing it as something that's going to collapse, or, you know, there's going to be an almighty explosion in societal terms. How do you think it can be addressed in a positive way in order to transcend the current regime? Anyway, thank you. That's a lot.
Well,
I know. Yeah. Okay. So.
Thank you, Aaron.
I think the only thing that can do it is the working class. I mean, only the working class is capable of taking American society in hand and bringing it to a new level of democratic socialist development. But it'll have to be revolutionary, because the existing constitutional order is heading for a complete and total self-destruction. I mean, I know I sound terribly apocalyptic, but I think it's really quite true. I mean, essentially, America has enjoyed more than 2 centuries of stability, give or take the odd civil war, rebellion, assassination, etc. But now it's nice. It's going to be facing an extended period of deepening turbulence, and the only force capable of rescuing American society is the working class. I also must point out, by the way, that America is not just a country; it's an empire, the first global empire we've ever seen. So the American political crisis is simultaneously an imperial crisis and a capitalist crisis too, of course. So we're seeing all these convulsions merging into one.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to go to Diana now, and then Kenneth.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah, I'm sort of going back a bit again now. Where did the Native Americans fit in with the revolutionary conflict? What was the relationship between the African slaves and Native Americans? And what was the impact on the history of the environmental what was its impact on the history of environmental and ecological degradation in the US? And to sort of comment on what's happening more today is that the Native Americans are at the forefront of fighting to save the US environment.
Okay. Well, first of all, the Native Americans were of course, were the victims of American nation building, and the Americans were land hungry, and therefore they essentially, once they gained independence, they essentially drove the Native Americans out of the entire region east of the Mississippi. It's one thing that's very interesting is the Cherokees, who lived in western Georgia at the time, actually developed a kind of a European-style government, and I believe, by the way, they even owned slaves. And despite their quote civilization, the American government under Andrew Jackson drove them to the west, all the more forcefully, because the only thing worse than an underdeveloped Indian nation was a overdeveloped Indian nation, from as far as Americans were concerned. But Americans gained the right to kill Indians on sight. I believe in the Northwest Territories and what's now Ohio and Indiana, I read somewhere that never did a jury, a white jury, which juries were by definition white, never did a jury convict a white man of murder for killing an Indian. So the Americans gained essentially the right, the freedom to kill Indians on sight, and Black Americans, at least Black slaves. Not all Black Americans were slaves, but those who were slaves, as I pointed out earlier, were actually royalist in their sympathies. They were skeptical, obviously, of American patriotism, and believed that the British would treat them more fairly, which is probably correct. And that's the environmental impact. The headlong rush to the west created tremendous environmental disruptions, and industrialization, of course, created immense changes. I'm not a green, so I'm certainly not an enemy of industrialization, but certainly the headlong industrialization was done without any consideration whatsoever to the environmental impacts. But only by the 1880s or 90s did America develop any kind of environmental movement. But even in this case, the movement was heavily stamped by emerging American imperialism. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president from 1898, I think it was, to 1903, I'm not quite sure of those dates, was a champion of the Western environment, but was also a ferocious racist and American and imperialist. So American environmentalism, whatever you might think of it, was heavily stamped with racism, nationalism, and imperialism from the very start.
Thanks, Daniel. We've got Kenneth next, and then Tony, and then we've got two questions from the text.
Good evening, Daniel. Thank you very much for your talk. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Thanks. You said that the American working class shouldn't put its faith in either Biden or Trump, but should mobilize separately. Do you think that the American working class is perhaps already divided by race issues, and it's further complicated by the fact you've got so many different states in America with different conditions? Is it plausible that there would be a national working class movement in America, and who might there be to lead such a movement? Thank you.
Well, it's no more plausible than there would have been one in Russia in the 1890s, or in China in the 1920s or 30s. I mean, these were very backwards countries with political climates that were deeply hostile to any kind of a socialist mobilization. They were rife with all kinds of backward prejudices and reactionary thinking. So the climates would seem to be utterly hostile to any kind of socialist movement. But the paradox of history is that that very hostility created the grounds for the powerful growth of a Marxist movement. You know, despite the distortions of the Chinese Revolution, but certainly in the case of the Russian Revolution. So yes, I think that's I'm fundamentally optimistic. America is divided by race. It's fragmented by this ridiculous 18th century federal structure. But at the same time, America has a very strong anti-racist movement. So there's no reason to be unduly pessimistic about race. I mean, the great majority of Americans are repulsed by racism. But of course, racism can't be merely overcome through some kind of moralistic effort. But certainly there's a strong basis for a strong anti-racist movement. And the federal structure, I think the entire constitutional structure is entering into a period of deepening crisis. And the more that crisis intensifies, the more federalism itself will go into crisis and will be open to question.
Mm. Thanks, Daniel. Tony.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the question of what I see as the constitutional gridlock in America. That the system is indeed running towards its end. If Trump manages to nominate a sixth conservative judge to the Supreme Court, the Democrats, whose program is extremely mild, to say the least, will not be able to get anything through, as far as I can see. Certainly anything the conservatives object to, like what remains of the Obama care, is going to be blocked. And given it's impossible to change the American Constitution, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you need 80% of the states to do that. It's some procedure, the states, and then 2/3 of Congress, I think. It would seem that it's set up for a clash, because clearly the Supreme Court is actually taking on, in essence, a negative role in terms of legislation. So there's the separation of powers have gone as well. So it seems to me an appalling mess, even in bourgeois democratic terms. Not that I think the United States is particularly democratic. Clearly not. But I mean, I think that is actually what Trump represents. And I still think it's up in the air as to who is going to actually win on the day, although Trump would appear to be doing his best to lose the election, I grant. So over to you.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, in classic liberal ideology is all about protection of minority rights, and it's all about constraining the right of the majority, the power of the majority, which is seen as being inherently tyrannical. And America carries this to an extreme. That is the essence of the US Constitution. Before the Civil War, the number of large slave owners was actually fairly small, only a few thousand, but the Constitution allowed them to essentially dominate the national government. And now what we see now is a minority dictatorship. The Senate, the upper house, America's House of Lords, is organized on a one state, two vote basis, which means that California, which is a population of nearly 40 million, has the same number of senators as Wyoming, whose population is under 700,000 people. So 54% of the population lives in just 10 states, which means they are outvoted 4-1 in the Senate by the minority that lives in the remainder. And the House is a very heavily gerrymandered body, which also minority. to essentially exert a dictatorship on the country as a whole. The Electoral College does the same thing by more the weight of underpopulated states like Wyoming or Vermont. And the Supreme Court is now the leading example. I mean, if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, as I can't see how she won't be confirmed, she could sit on the bench for 40 more years. Essentially, her imposing her arch conservative views on the rest of the nation, and the nation will be powerless to do anything about it. The Democratic majority will be completely stymied. And the 6-3 conservative majority in the court, which will probably last for a decade or more, there'll be nothing the Democrats can do. And whatever progressive legislation, even assuming the Democrats introduce any kind of progressive legislation, whatever efforts they make, however feeble in that direction, will be almost certainly struck down by the court. And there will be nothing they can do about it. It's astonishingly undemocratic, and it will lead to an explosion because the forces are building. The condition of the American working class is increasingly desperate. The social conditions are deteriorating rapidly. So yes, so America is definitely facing a crunch.
Thank you, Daniel. I've got 2 questions I've taken from the text, so I should do my best to articulate these. This first one's from George. His question is, could in theory the Constitution be changed? Is the Constitution a block to socialism? And if so, how?
Yes, the answer to that is no, it cannot be changed. Tony alluded to the amending process. The amending process is set forth in Article 5 of the Constitution, and it says that for any change to be made, it must be approved by 2/3 of each house, plus 3/4 of the states. So 3/4 of the 50 states means 38 states, which means that 13 states can veto any constitutional amendment. And 13 states can amount to as little as 4.4% of the US population. Mm-hmm. And that is an insuperable barrier. It's simply impossible. There has not been a constitutional amendment since the early 1970s. There will probably not be one for another half century. So the Constitution is completely frozen. It's an absolute impediment to any kind of democratic change. And as a result, the country is disappearing beneath the waves of a authoritarian oligarchy.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And a final question from Helen, and then you can summarize. So Helen would like to ask, what social, political, and economic institutions are holding the USA together at present, and which of these derive from the American Revolution?
Well, America is the ultimate law-bound society. I don't know if any listeners have spent any time in the U.S., but when you arrive in the U.S. and you spend any time here at all, what people will tell you is, we'll talk to you about is the Constitution. The Constitution is this great Ark of the Covenant, which essentially cements America together. I mean, historical now, you have to think, I have to go back to the Bible in the Middle Ages, or the Torah in rabbinic Jewish society, or the Quran in Muslim society. But the Constitution is this holy text, which essentially is the basis for U.S. society. The Constitution came first, and the U.S. was then constructed on the basis of that document. So without the Constitution, there's kind of nothing. So Americans really can't imagine life without a Constitution, in the same way that medieval Europeans couldn't have conceived of life without a king or without a Catholic Church. And so essentially, once this structure goes, and it is going, America will be cast off into the unknown, as France was in May 1789. I'm convinced that that kind of crunch is on the way, and that the stablest of societies will rapidly become the most unstable of societies.
Thank you. Would you like to take a couple of moments to summarize?
Sure. But just 5 or 10 minutes, is that enough?
Sure, yeah.
So I just think the important thing to understand about America is this concept of a conservative democracy. The country is structured in such a way, and this is the direct legacy of the revolution of 1776. The country is structured in such a way as to turn democracy in a conservative direction. That means that Americans don't look to themselves, they don't look to the future, they don't welcome change. They see all progress as a process of restoration, kind of a circling around to eternal truths which were present at the nation's founding and which somehow have been lost along the way. And progress is always envisioned as a return, a circling back to those eternal truths. I mean, I don't know if you know, but in America, books about America's founders are surefire bestsellers. Americans are always reading books about Washington, Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and in fact, we even have a hit Broadway play, a musical, Hamilton, which has been turned into a Disney movie, which is making scads of money for its composer, Lin-Manuel, got his last name. So Americans are really captured in any number of different ways by this founding period. They are kind of prisoners of this period. And they believe that all wisdom, lays in this period of 230 years ago, and that wisdom can only be recaptured by returning to that period. I mean, Sunni Islam, by the way, has a very similar concept of the Quran. This is the defining mindset of America. And it's why America is so frozen and so politically stymied, because the system has stopped working. We've had a generation of gridlock on Capitol Hill, which has led to a deepening, albeit still non-shooting war on Capitol Hill. We've had the popular results in federal and presidential elections overturned twice in the last 20 years. We've had a dictatorial Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone knows the litany of things. But Americans have no answer, because the only answer they can conceive of, the only answer they're programmed to spit out, is somehow to return to the founding period and ask themselves, what would the founders do? So the first thing that Americans must do is liberate themselves from this mindset, cast off this awful traditionalism, this mind-deadening, stultifying traditionalism, and make their way into the future under their own power. Now, of course, this is not simply a process of ideas. This must be a process that emerges out of material political struggle. But the ideological change will be to cast off this dictatorship of the past and to embrace the new, to march firmly into the future, and to recognize that America must come up with new answers to its problems.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. You've possibly been too busy to notice the positive feedback, but I can assure you it's been relentless. This has been a fascinating talk. A conservative regime, a global empire crumbling. in its death throes, but there's some optimism. Comrades, it's been a pleasure to welcome you to this session on the American revolutionary tradition. Next week, we return back across the pond. Real equality or death, the conspiracy of equals and the French Revolution. Comrades, we have been the Labour Left Alliance, the home of the resistance. Educate, organise, fight. Good night.
Thank you.